When we read the story of Jesus, certain names rise to the surface with power and clarity. We remember Peter's boldness, John's closeness, Mary's devotion, and Paul's missionary zeal. Yet within this great tapestry of faith, there is another figure who appears quietly, almost hidden, and yet whose actions carried immense weight. His name is Joseph of Arimathea, and though his voice is never heard in the Gospels, his faith still speaks across time. Joseph enters the story at the very moment when hope seemed lost. Jesus had been crucified, his disciples scattered, and the world seemed wrapped in silence and despair. It was then that Joseph, a man of status and respect, chose to step forward. He did not come with speeches or miracles, but with a single act of courage and devotion that would shape the course of Christian history forever. What makes Joseph's story so compelling is the paradox it presents. How could a man so briefly mentioned, a man who remained silent while others filled the pages of Scripture with words and deeds, become the one who prepared the way for the greatest victory of all? His quiet presence in the narrative reminds us that faith is not always measured in volume, but often in the stillness of the heart and the boldness of timely action. Joseph's example invites us to consider the hidden ways in which faith works. It shows us that even when we feel unseen, unnoticed, or without great influence, our devotion still matters. His life speaks to all who wonder if their quiet acts of love, generosity, or faithfulness have any real impact. Joseph proves that when the moment comes, even a single act can become part of eternity. The story of Joseph of Arimathea is not one of fame, but of faith, not of power, but of trust, not of noise, but of silence filled with devotion. By stepping into his story, we discover the beauty of a faith that does not demand attention, yet transforms history with its quiet strength. If you enjoy films that uncover the hidden treasures of Scripture and bring out the stories of faith that often go unnoticed, make sure to subscribe to this channel, give this video a like, and leave a comment with your thoughts. Your support helps us continue sharing these powerful stories, and it lets others find encouragement just as you have today. Joseph of Arimathea was not a poor fisherman nor an unnoticed wanderer, but a man of standing and respect. The Gospels describe him as a wealthy figure, a member of the Sanhedrin, the ruling council of Jewish leaders in Jerusalem. This position alone would have set him apart from the ordinary crowds who followed Jesus, for it meant he lived in the upper echelons of society, with influence, authority, and the comforts of prosperity. He was a man whose name carried weight in his community, someone whose opinions would have been heard in the council chamber, someone others might have envied or even feared. Wealth in Joseph's world was not simply about possessions, but about power, connections, and reputation. To be a man of means meant having a voice in decisions that shaped the lives of others, yet it also carried expectations. Such men were expected to preserve tradition, protect the influence of their peers, and defend the standing of the ruling body. Aligning with Jesus, an untrained rabbi from Nazareth who stirred controversy and challenged authority, was not something a man of Joseph's class would typically consider, yet Joseph's faith moved him in another direction. The Scriptures call him a disciple of Jesus, though a secret one for fear of the Jews. That simple description tells a story in itself. It reveals a man whose heart had been stirred by Jesus' words, whose soul had been moved by his presence, yet who also knew the cost of being too open about that allegiance. He lived in two worlds, the world of wealth and influence, and the world of faith that was drawing him into something deeper than position or possessions. For Joseph, faith was not measured in loud proclamations, but in the quiet conviction that Jesus was more than a passing teacher, more than just another wandering preacher. His belief, though hidden, was genuine. It took root in the soil of privilege, proving that devotion to Christ was not limited to fishermen and tax collectors, but could take hold in the heart of someone surrounded by abundance. His wealth, too, would become a vessel for faith. While others offered their loyalty, Joseph would later offer something far more costly, the very tomb he had prepared for himself, a burial place that represented permanence, legacy, and dignity. By giving it away, he revealed that his trust in Jesus outweighed even his concern for his own remembrance. Joseph's life shows that faith does not require the abandonment of one's station, but a willingness to use it for something greater. His resources and influence were not ends in themselves, but tools waiting to be placed in the service of God's plan. The measure of his wealth was not in gold or land, but in how freely he surrendered it when the moment demanded. His example challenges the notion that faith belongs only to the poor and oppressed. It reminds us that God calls people from every walk of life, whether standing in fields or sitting in council chambers. What matters is not the amount of wealth one possesses, but the depth of trust and the willingness to let faith outweigh fear. Joseph's place among the rulers made his devotion riskier, yet that risk only magnified the strength of his heart. He lived within a world that would have condemned Jesus, yet he carried in secret the seed of belief that would one day bloom into courage. His life asks us to consider what it means to hold influence and yet remain humble, to carry wealth yet be ready to give it away, to walk among the powerful and yet belong to a kingdom not of this world. Joseph of Arimathea was not defined by his riches, but by his faith. Though he stood among the mighty, he chose to listen to the quiet truth stirring within his soul. That truth would lead him into conflict, not only with his peers, but with his own fear, as the growing hostility toward Jesus brought him to a crossroads that no wealth could shield him from. Joseph's world was not an easy one for a man who believed in Jesus. The Sanhedrin, of which he was a member, had become the very body that sought to condemn Jesus to death. It was a council of religious leaders, men charged with interpreting the law and guiding the people. Yet they were also deeply entangled in politics, jealous of their power, and resistant to any who threatened their authority. To stand among them and yet hold sympathy for Jesus was to carry a dangerous secret. The Gospels note that Joseph had not consented to their decision regarding Jesus. This brief statement paints a powerful image. Imagine him seated in the chamber, surrounded by angry voices, the air thick with accusation, the leaders declaring that Jesus was a blasphemer deserving death. Joseph, perhaps silent, perhaps with words restrained, stood apart from the majority. He did not join their cry for blood. His heart, touched by the truth of Christ, would not allow it. The loneliness of such a position is not hard to imagine. To resist the majority even quietly is to feel the weight of isolation pressing heavily upon one's soul. Joseph must have known that his dissent, even if unspoken aloud, marked him as different, as suspect. Yet he carried that burden, choosing integrity over comfort, even while hiding his devotion from the public eye. The courage it took to resist in such a setting cannot be underestimated. The Sanhedrin was not a place for open defiance, and Joseph was not reckless. He measured his steps carefully, understanding that too bold a stance could bring ruin. But even in his caution, he preserved the truth within him. It was a quiet rebellion, but one no less real. The tension within him must have grown stronger as Jesus' ministry unfolded. He would have heard reports of miracles, of teachings that stirred the people, of signs that pointed to something greater than any human authority. Within the council chamber, such news might have been dismissed with anger or mockery. Yet in Joseph's heart, those reports found a home. To stand in opposition within a hostile environment is to live in constant conflict. Every word spoken against Jesus must have been a wound. Every plot to trap him in his speech, every scheme to discredit him must have cut deeply. Joseph carried within him a loyalty he could not yet reveal, a faith that remained hidden until the time was right. His position reminds us that following Christ is not always about open confrontation. Sometimes it is about standing firm in the midst of those who disagree, refusing to compromise even when silence is the only option. Joseph did not shout down his peers, yet he did not join their injustice. He bore his faith like a hidden flame, small but unextinguished. When the council finally delivered Jesus to Pilate, demanding his crucifixion, Joseph's role as a dissenter became even more precarious. The voices around him had grown louder, the pressure greater, and yet he remained unmoved in his conviction. The quiet man who did not consent became the man who, when the moment came, would act in ways that none of his peers could have foreseen. This contrast between the hostility of the council and the tenderness of Joseph's faith prepares us to see the kind of courage that would later define him. He did not fight his peers with arguments, but he would honor Jesus in a way that spoke louder than words ever could. Out of the heat of opposition, Joseph's faith was refined, preparing him for the decisive act that history would remember forever. The world Joseph lived in was noisy with accusations, debates, and shouts of condemnation. Public life was filled with arguments about law and tradition, about Rome's presence, about messianic hopes and fears. Against that backdrop, Joseph's faith remained quiet. He was not a man of loud declarations. He did not gather crowds or proclaim his loyalty on street corners. His courage was measured not in speeches, but in steady resolve. There is a kind of strength that shines in public and another that holds steady in private. Joseph embodied the latter. His was the courage of a man who did not need recognition, who did not seek the spotlight, but who chose to act when the moment demanded it. While others shouted for justice in the way they understood it, Joseph's faith whispered of a deeper truth that could not be silenced. Silent courage is often harder than loud bravery. To remain faithful without applause, to stand firm without recognition, requires a strength that is hidden from the eyes of others. Joseph lived this hidden strength. His faith did not echo across the streets, but it held firm in the secrecy of his devotion until it could be revealed in action. In a world that measures value by visibility, Joseph reminds us of the unseen. He represents those who labor in silence, whose contributions are overlooked, yet whose faithfulness is no less vital. His role shows that God does not measure by volume, but by sincerity, not by the size of the crowd, but by the depth of conviction. Even as hostility rose around Jesus, Joseph's devotion did not falter. His silence was not weakness, but wisdom. He knew when to remain hidden and when to step forward. Timing is often as crucial as courage, and Joseph's story demonstrates that both can come together in a single, decisive act. His life challenges our notions of influence. Many think that only those who stand in the public eye shape history, yet Joseph proves otherwise. By remaining true in silence, he preserved his faith until the moment when action was required, and when that time arrived, he was ready. We often admire the disciples who preached with boldness, yet Joseph's legacy speaks to those whose lives are lived quietly, without public acclaim. His faith belongs to the countless who serve without recognition, who love without praise, who act without expectation of reward. They may not make headlines, but they change lives. And in doing so, they honor God in ways the world cannot measure. Joseph's courage was not the kind that sparked crowds, but the kind that stood firm in the heart. It was a steady flame that could not be extinguished by fear or opposition. That flame would soon burn brightest in the most dangerous moment of his life, when silence would no longer be enough, and when his faith would move him to act in open defiance of the powers around him. The crucifixion had ended. Jesus hung lifeless upon the cross, his followers scattered in grief, his enemies satisfied that his voice had been silenced. Yet in that moment of despair, Joseph of Arimathea stepped forward in a way that stunned those who knew him. He went directly to Pilate, the Roman governor, and asked for the body of Jesus. This act was far from simple. To request the body of a condemned man was to identify oneself with him. Crucifixion was Rome's ultimate punishment, reserved for rebels and criminals. Those who were crucified were meant to be shamed, left on display as a warning. For Joseph, a respected member of the Sanhedrin, to ask for the body of Jesus was to risk being seen as sympathizing with one Rome had executed as a threat. The risk was not only political, but personal. Pilate himself was a man known for cruelty and unpredictability. Approaching him was dangerous, especially with such a sensitive request. Yet Joseph walked into the presence of power with determination, ready to bear the cost of being associated with Jesus. This was the moment when Joseph stepped out of the shadows. The secret disciple, the quiet man of faith, now revealed himself openly. His request was a declaration, not in words of belief, but in action that spoke louder than any sermon. He was saying, without speaking, that Jesus mattered to him, that he was not a criminal to be discarded, but a teacher, a master, a man worthy of honor even in death. One can imagine the surprise of Pilate granting this request. Perhaps he saw in Joseph's courage something unusual, something that carried more weight than mere sentiment. Pilate, who had struggled with his own conscience regarding Jesus, now faced a man of stature, willing to risk everything to care for the crucified one. For Joseph, this was more than the boldness of a moment. It was the culmination of faith that had been growing quietly, preparing him for this step. His silence had preserved him until the right time, and now his courage was revealed in an act that could not be hidden. The other disciples were in hiding, crushed by fear, but Joseph stood before authority with resolve. His courage reminds us that faith sometimes demands open risk, that the moment arrives when secrecy can no longer suffice, when devotion must be revealed for all to see. Joseph's request changed the story. Without him, Jesus' body might have been left to decay, as was common with the condemned. Instead, through Joseph's boldness, Jesus was given a burial that fulfilled prophecy and set the stage for the miracle of resurrection. The quiet man had now spoken through action, and history would never be the same. After Joseph's bold request before Pilate, another act of devotion followed, one that revealed both his generosity and the depth of his faith. He laid Jesus in his own tomb, a place he had prepared for himself. This was not a common grave, not a rough pit for the condemned, but a new tomb cut out of solid rock, reserved for one of wealth and honor. By giving it away, Joseph surrendered something deeply personal, a place meant to preserve his own dignity in death. The gift of the tomb was not a small gesture. In Jewish tradition, a burial site was a lasting possession, something tied to family, heritage, and remembrance. For Joseph to give his own tomb to Jesus was to give away his legacy, to exchange his personal monument for an eternal testimony. What had been prepared for himself became instead the resting place of the one who would not remain there. This act of sacrifice spoke louder than words ever could. Joseph could have quietly admired Jesus, kept his respect hidden, and left the body of the crucified rabbi to others. Instead, he used what was most costly to him as an offering of devotion. In doing so, he revealed that his wealth was not his treasure, but that his faith was his true inheritance. The tomb itself becomes part of the story of salvation. A stone-hewn chamber, untouched by death until that moment, received the body of Jesus. Its silence and stillness became the backdrop for the greatest event in human history. Joseph could not have imagined that his act of generosity would place him at the center of prophecy, that his tomb would become the doorway through which resurrection would step into the world. Every detail of the burial was marked by care. Joseph, along with Nicodemus, wrapped the body in linen and spices, honoring Jesus with the dignity of a king. The same council that condemned him now saw one of their own treat him with reverence, a striking contrast to the shame of crucifixion. Joseph's actions declared that Jesus was not to be remembered as a criminal, but as one worthy of honor beyond measure. The stone that sealed the tomb seemed to mark the finality of death, yet it also prepared the stage for life to break forth. Joseph's gift became more than a place of rest. It became the vessel of triumph, where mortality was clothed in immortality. His generosity shaped the very landscape of resurrection. This moment reminds us that what we give to God is never lost. Joseph gave away his tomb, but in that surrender, he received something far greater, the honor of being forever linked to the greatest event in history. His willingness to part with what was his became the means by which the eternal story unfolded. The tomb stands as a symbol not of Joseph's loss, but of Christ's victory. In that quiet garden, generosity met prophecy, and faith met eternity. Joseph's decision to give away what was most precious became the key to a moment that continues to shape the hope of the world. Long before Joseph of Arimathea offered his tomb, the prophet Isaiah had spoken of the servant of God, saying that he would be assigned a grave with the wicked, yet with the rich in his death. These words lingered across centuries, and in Joseph's act they found their fulfillment. What seemed like a simple gesture of devotion became the very thread that tied the present moment to the ancient promises of God. Prophecy often unfolds in ways that surprise the human heart. Joseph was not a prophet, not a preacher, yet his quiet obedience placed him within the fabric of divine design. Without fanfare, without even his awareness perhaps, his deed aligned perfectly with the words spoken long before his birth. He became part of a tapestry greater than himself, a vessel for a promise that would echo across generations. This fulfillment reveals something profound about the ways of God. Prophecy does not depend only on kings or great leaders. It can come to pass through the humble, the hidden, and the quiet. Joseph's willingness to act, his courage to step forward, became the means by which Scripture was completed. His silence, his lack of recorded words, became a powerful witness that God's plan moves forward even through the unnoticed. Imagine the irony that those who condemned Jesus sought to erase his memory, yet in doing so, they only helped to confirm what had been foretold. The rulers thought they were silencing him, but in truth, their actions brought about the very fulfillment of prophecy. Into that space of darkness stepped Joseph, and his single act gave visible proof that God's word cannot fail. The beauty of prophecy is not only in its fulfillment, but in the assurance it gives. When Joseph placed Jesus in his tomb, it was not simply an act of kindness, but the visible sign that God's plan was unfolding exactly as promised. The silence of Joseph's deed thundered with the truth that every word spoken by God comes to pass. This connection between Joseph's offering and Isaiah's prophecy elevates his role from a personal act to a cosmic moment. The man who seemed to dwell in the background became the bridge between promise and reality, between prophecy and fulfillment. His obedience, though quiet, resounded through eternity. It is striking that Joseph did not need to proclaim anything. His deed alone was the sermon, his generosity the message. By aligning himself with Jesus at his burial, Joseph showed that faith is not only about speaking truth, but about living it. His silent faith became a proclamation louder than words. The fulfillment of prophecy in Joseph's act reminds us that no detail of God's plan is left unfinished. Even the choice of a tomb, even the generosity of a quiet disciple becomes part of a story written long before. Joseph's faith was caught up in the eternal design, and his silence became the instrument of a prophecy fulfilled. The hours after the crucifixion were heavy with despair. The disciples had scattered, their courage shattered by fear. The crowds who once shouted in triumph were gone. Hope seemed buried under the weight of sorrow. Into this atmosphere of grief stepped Joseph of Arimathea, a man whose faith did not collapse under the shadow of the cross. Faith in moments of triumph is one thing, faith in moments of apparent defeat is another. When Jesus breathed his last, when darkness covered the land, Joseph still believed enough to act. He did not abandon his devotion when the movement seemed destroyed. Instead, he revealed that true faith shines brightest when the light seems gone. The cross was meant to break spirits, to silence voices, to instill fear. For Joseph, it became the moment to reveal trust. He chose to stand with the one the world had rejected, to honor the crucified when others had hidden. His faith was not built on victory as the world defines it, but on loyalty to the one he knew to be worthy of honor, even in death. This kind of faith is rare. Many follow when crowds cheer, when miracles dazzle, when hope feels strong. But Joseph's faith endured in silence, when nothing appeared certain, when all seemed lost. His actions remind us that belief is not measured by circumstances, but by steadfastness. The shadows of the cross could have crushed him, yet they only drew out the depth of his devotion. While others trembled, Joseph stood firm. His courage was not loud, but it was real. He chose to act when despair hung heavy, proving that faith does not fade when tested but grows stronger. Such faith is what sustains in seasons of darkness. Joseph's example calls us to trust even when hope seems buried, to believe even when the world says it is over. His courage shows that faith is not about understanding every detail, but about standing firm in loyalty to the one who is greater than all appearances. The beauty of Joseph's faith is that it was not crushed by the cross, but shaped by it. In the darkest moment of the story, he revealed a devotion that refused to bow to fear. He saw not defeat, but the worthiness of Jesus, and that vision gave him strength. Through Joseph, we learn that faith is not proven in comfort but in challenge, not in clarity but in confusion, not in daylight but in shadows. His life speaks to all who carry quiet faith in difficult times. Hold steady, for even in the silence of the tomb, God is at work. Joseph of Arimathea speaks through history not with recorded words, but with a single decisive act. His name is remembered not because of speeches or writings, but because his deed at the burial of Jesus carried the weight of eternity. He stands as a testament that faith is measured not only in what we say, but in what we do when it matters most. His legacy is unusual. While others preached, traveled, and founded churches, Joseph is remembered for one choice, one offering, one moment of courage. Yet that one moment has echoed through centuries, reminding every generation that even the quiet can change the story of the world. The power of Joseph's legacy lies in its simplicity. He was not a leader of crowds, not a writer of letters, not a miracle worker. He was a man who acted faithfully when the moment demanded it, and that was enough for his name to be etched into the gospel story forever. His life reminds us that greatness in faith is not about visibility, but about obedience. Many disciples of Christ throughout history have lived and died without recognition, their names forgotten by the world. Yet in the eyes of God, their faith is remembered, just as Joseph's is remembered. His story speaks for all who labor in obscurity, who love quietly, who remain faithful without applause. Joseph's life shows us that a single act of devotion can carry eternal weight. By giving his tomb, he gave himself, offering not only a possession, but a testimony of faith. His courage lives on, not in monuments or grand stories, but in the simple truth that he was faithful in his moment. His legacy challenges us to think differently about influence. Not all are called to be apostles, preachers, or prophets. Some are called to be Josephs, whose quiet strength shapes history in ways unseen until the right moment comes. The measure of their lives is not in fame, but in faithfulness. The quiet disciple still speaks. His silence reminds us that faith does not need many words, only genuine trust. His courage shows that devotion does not need to be loud to be real. His gift of the tomb tells us that what is surrendered to Christ becomes part of eternity. As the centuries pass, Joseph's name continues to remind us that God uses the hidden as well as the visible, the quiet as well as the bold. His life is a call to all who wonder if their faith matters, a testimony that even the smallest act of devotion can shape the future in ways beyond imagination. Joseph of Arimathea's story does not fade with the closing of the Gospel pages, for it continues to speak into the lives of those who walk in faith today. His example shows us that history is not shaped only by those who stand in pulpits or lead crowds, but also by those who quietly remain faithful, who choose obedience over recognition, and who act with devotion even when the world is watching in silence. In our modern world, where voices compete to be heard, where value is often measured by visibility and influence, Joseph's legacy reminds us that quiet faith has power. His life teaches us that we do not need to be famous or celebrated to make an eternal impact. What matters is the willingness to step forward when the moment comes, to give what we have, and to live faithfully even if no one applauds. Many people carry faith in ways that seem hidden. Parents raising children with love and patience, caregivers tending to those in need, workers who live with integrity in places where no one notices. All of these mirror Joseph's silent devotion. Their faith may never be broadcast, yet it carries a strength that shapes lives and honors God. Joseph's life calls us to remember that acts of faith do not need to be grand to be great. A prayer spoken in secret, a kindness offered without expectation, a sacrifice made quietly for someone else. These things carry eternal weight. Just as Joseph's tomb became part of the resurrection story, so too our hidden faith can become part of the unfolding work of God in the world. Silent faith does not mean weak faith. On the contrary, it often requires more courage to stand quietly than to shout loudly. It takes strength to remain true without recognition, to give without acknowledgement, to act without reward. Joseph's story reminds us that God sees the hidden, values the unseen, and honors the faithful heart. We are invited to live as Joseph did, not in pursuit of recognition, but in pursuit of obedience, to give our time, our resources, our hearts, knowing that nothing surrendered in faith is ever wasted. The world may overlook these things, but heaven does not. Every act of devotion, no matter how quiet, is written into the eternal story. Joseph's courage challenges us to be ready when our moment comes. He lived in silence until the hour arrived, when silence was no longer enough, and when that time came, he acted with courage. Our own lives may bring moments when faith must move from hidden devotion to visible action. His example assures us that when that moment comes, the strength to act will be found in the faith we have carried all along. The story of Joseph of Arimathea leaves us with hope. It tells us that no act of faith is too small, no life too hidden, no offering too quiet. What matters is the sincerity of the heart and the willingness to give when God calls. The quiet disciple changed history, and his life continues to remind us that faith, whether shouted from rooftops or lived in silence, holds the power to shape eternity. Thank you for joining us in reflecting on the life of Joseph of Arimathea, the quiet man whose faith changed the story of history. If you found this message meaningful, we invite you to subscribe to the channel so you will not miss future videos. Please take a moment to like this film, leave a comment to share your thoughts, and pass it along to your family and friends so that they too may be encouraged by this story of faith and courage.